I watched my husband adjust his tie nervously from across the room. He couldn't meet my eyes. 6 months of his affair with Olivia had taught me patience, a virtue I'd need for what came next. The paternity test kit weighed heavy in my purse, as Olivia placed her hands over her swollen belly, accepting congratulations from our friends. My friends, in my in-laws' home. "Our little blessing," she called it, shooting me a triumphant glance. What she didn't know was that I had uncovered every secret, every lie, every stolen moment. What Daniel didn't realize was that this baby shower, this celebration of his betrayal, would be the stage for his undoing. They thought I was broken. They were about to discover I was dangerous. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The chatter of excited voices filled the room as I watched from the sidelines, champagne flute in hand. Every muscle in my body remained perfectly relaxed as I took a sip of my drink. I had practiced this moment too many times in my mind to mess it up now. Across the tastefully decorated living room of Daniel's parents' mansion, my husband, technically still my husband, nervously adjusted his tie for what must have been the 10th time in 5 minutes. He kept throwing anxious glances around the room, deliberately avoiding the corner where I stood. The weight of the envelope in my purse felt satisfying. Today, everything would change. "Oh my goodness, you're absolutely glowing," one of the older women cooed, placing her hand on Olivia's round belly. I watched as Olivia placed her own hands, protectively over her stomach, her face lighting up with practiced joy. "Thank you. Only 2 more months to go. We're beyond excited." We. As if she and Daniel were already some established unit. As if I didn't exist. As if 10 years of marriage could be erased by her baby bump and her calculated smiles. I took another sip of my champagne, savoring the bitter effervescence. The envelope in my purse weighed heavy against my hip. My secret weapon, my insurance policy, my vindication. The party was in full swing now. Olivia's friends, most of whom I recognized from the country club, circled around her like satellites, showering her with compliments and touching her stomach without permission. The audacity of this woman never ceased to amaze me. Hosting a baby shower for her affair baby, while my husband's divorce papers sat unsigned on my kitchen counter. Daniel's mother caught my eye from across the room. Margaret Walker was a formidable woman who had built her entire life around appearances. The slight nod she gave me contained both acknowledgement and tacit permission. She knew I was up to something, and she wasn't going to stop me. Maybe deep down, she wanted to see her son held accountable too. I finished my champagne and placed the empty glass on a nearby table. It was almost time. Olivia tapped her glass with a small silver spoon, calling for everyone's attention. The room gradually quieted as all eyes turned to her. "Thank you all so much for coming today," she began, her voice honey-sweet with rehearsed sincerity. "This means the world to Daniel and me." She reached out for Daniel's hand, pulling him close to her side. He complied, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the artificial stretch of his smile. "We've had quite a journey to get here," Olivia continued, and I had to suppress a laugh. "Quite a journey indeed. A journey of lies, deceit, and betrayal. But now we're starting our beautiful family, and we couldn't be happier." She looked up at Daniel with wide, adoring eyes. "Daniel is going to be the most amazing father. I just know it." As she spoke, her gaze drifted over to me, and for a brief moment, our eyes locked. There it was, that flash of smug triumph. She thought she'd won. She genuinely believed that stealing my husband was her victory lap. It was time to change that. Stepped forward, the envelope now in my hand. My heels clicked rhythmically against the hardwood floor as I approached the happy couple. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. "Congratulations, Olivia," I said, my voice steady and pleasant. I extended my hand, offering the envelope to Daniel. I brought a little gift. Daniel stared at the envelope like it might bite him. What is this, Sophia? He forced a laugh, but a bead of sweat had formed at his hairline. Open it, I replied, my smile unwavering. His hands shook slightly as he took the envelope. The room had gone completely silent now, all pretense of casual party conversation abandoned. Are you really doing this here, Sophia? Daniel whispered, his voice strained. I tilted my head slightly. Do you remember what you told me on our 5th anniversary, Daniel? I asked, my voice loud enough for everyone to hear. You said, "You're my wife. If you ever feel like you need proof of anything, I'll give it to you." I'm just cashing in on that promise. Color drained from his face as he realized what the envelope contained. A paternity test kit. Olivia's hand flew to her stomach in a theatrical display of shock. What is the meaning of this? She demanded, her voice rising an octave. Daniel, what is she doing? Daniel fumbled with the envelope, nearly dropping it. This is ridiculous. I'm not doing this. Not here. Why not? The deep voice of Robert, Walker, Daniel's father, cut through the tension. All eyes turned to the imposing figure standing at the edge of the crowd. If you're man enough to cheat on your wife, you should be man enough to prove you're the father of that child. The look of disappointment on Robert's face was something I'd never seen directed at his golden boy before. Daniel had always been the pride of the Walker family. Harvard Business School graduate, successful entrepreneur, perfect son. Until now. Daniel swallowed hard. Dad, this isn't the time or place. It seems like the perfect time to me, Robert interrupted. Either take the test or admit you have something to hide. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was savoring every second of this. Months of planning, of silent suffering, of gathering evidence, all leading to this moment. One of Olivia's friends, a nurse named Tracy, stepped forward. I can help with this. I've administered these tests before. She gave me a small nod of solidarity. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had doubts about Olivia's story. This is insane, Olivia protested, her voice shrill. Daniel, tell them. This is unnecessary. But Daniel had no escape. With his father's stern gaze fixed on him and the whispers of the guests growing louder, he reluctantly opened the envelope. The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of tension. Tracy efficiently collected the samples from both Daniel and Olivia's belly using the non-invasive prenatal test kit. I had spared no expense on this. It was the most advanced paternity test money could buy, offering same-day results with 99.9% accuracy. The samples were handed off to a lab courier who had been on standby, another detail I'd carefully arranged. The results would be expedited and delivered back to the party within hours. As the guests awkwardly mingled, trying to pretend this was all normal, I felt a strange sense of detachment wash over me. Everything around me seemed to slow down. The clinking of glasses, the nervous laughter, the sidelong glances. It was as if I was watching my own life from a distance. My mind drifted back to the beginning, to the first crack in our perfect marriage, to the moment I began to suspect that the man I loved was living a double life. 6 months earlier, my life had been picture perfect. At least, that's what everyone thought. Daniel and I were the golden couple of our social circle, successful, attractive, and seemingly devoted to each other. I had put my own career as an interior designer on hold to help Daniel build his tech, consulting business from the ground up. I managed his schedule, entertained his clients, and supported him through every challenge. I was the perfect wife, and I thought he was the perfect husband, until the little things started to add up. It began with the late nights. Daniel had always worked long hours, but suddenly his schedule became erratic. He would call to say he'd be home by 8, then walk through the door at midnight, smelling of alcohol and wearing a distracted expression. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague, lacking the detail and enthusiasm he used to share with me. Just the usual client meetings, he'd say, eyes glued to his phone. Nothing interesting. Then came the changes in his appearance. Daniel had always been handsome, but in a comfortable, familiar way. He didn't fuss over his looks or spend much time on grooming. Suddenly, he was getting expensive haircuts every 2 weeks, buying new cologne, and spending hours at the gym. Just trying to stay healthy, he explained when I commented on his new fitness routine. You're always telling me to take better care of myself. I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. One evening, while loading the washing machine, I picked up his dress shirt from the day before. As I checked the pockets, a habit from years of rescuing receipts and forgotten business cards, I caught a whiff of something floral. Perfume. Not mine. I held the shirt to my nose and inhaled deeply. The scent was unmistakable, jasmine with undertones of vanilla. I owned nothing like it. When Daniel came home that night, I casually mentioned finding lipstick on his collar. What? Where? He immediately pulled off his tie and examined his current shirt. Panicked. On yesterday's shirt, I said, watching his reaction carefully. When I was doing laundry. His relief was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. The slight relaxation of his shoulders, the controlled exhale. Oh, that must have been from Melissa. At the office. She hugged me after we landed that new client. You know how she is, always wearing that bright red lipstick. Melissa, his 60-year-old office manager who exclusively wore nude lipstick and had never hugged anyone in her life. I nodded and smiled. Right, of course. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to his even breathing, wondering when my husband had become such a practiced liar. The evidence continued to mount. Mysterious charges appeared on our joint credit card statement, a $850 purchase, at Tiffany & Co. that I never received, a dinner for two at La Maison, an exclusive French restaurant we had never visited together. It was a client dinner, Daniel explained when I asked about the restaurant charge. I forgot to use the company card. And Tiffany's? I pressed, keeping my voice light, curious. He didn't even hesitate. A gift for my mother's birthday. I called Margaret the next day under the pretense of discussing her birthday celebration. She hadn't received any gift from Tiffany's. The lie was becoming clearer, but I needed more proof. I needed to be strategic. One night, I pretended to be asleep when Daniel's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Through barely opened eyes, I watched him check the screen, then carefully slide out of bed and tiptoe to the bathroom. The door closed softly behind him, but not completely. Through the narrow opening, I could hear his hushed voice. I miss you too, he whispered. I know. It's complicated. No, she doesn't suspect anything. I'll figure it out, I promise. Just give me time. His tone was tender, affectionate, a tone I hadn't heard directed at me in months. My heart clenched painfully in my chest, but I forced myself to remain still when he returned to bed. I kept my breathing deep, and even as he slid under the covers, keeping a careful distance between our bodies. The next morning, I made an appointment with a private investigator. James Fisher had come highly recommended by my college roommate, who'd gone through a similar situation years before. His office was discreet, tucked away in a corporate building downtown where no one would recognize me. I need to know if my husband is having an affair, I told him, my voice steady despite the humiliation burning in my chest. I need proof that will hold up in court if necessary. James was professional and matter-of-fact. We'll need his schedule, routines, details about suspicious behavior patterns, and access to any shared accounts you have legitimate access to. The more information you can provide, the faster we can verify your suspicions. I handed him a folder containing everything he needed: Daniel's work schedule, gym membership information, our joint bank statements, and a list of unexplained absences and inconsistencies I'd documented over the past few weeks. "You've been thorough," James commented, impressed. "Most clients come in here emotional and unprepared." I gave him a tight smile. "I'm not most clients. I don't want emotions clouding my judgment. I want facts." 2 weeks later, James delivered those facts in the form of a manila envelope. I waited until Daniel left for a business dinner before opening it in our home office. Inside were dozens of photographs, each one a dagger to my heart. Daniel, entering a boutique hotel downtown. Daniel, having lunch with a young woman I didn't recognize. Daniel, kissing this woman in the privacy of a cafe corner booth. Daniel, holding her hand as they walked through the park. The woman was beautiful, tall and slender with long, dark hair and an elegant way of moving. I studied her face, trying to place her. She looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't recall where I might have seen her before. The final photo made my stomach turn. Daniel and this woman standing outside an OBGYN office, his hand protectively placed on her lower back as he guided her through the door. I sat at my desk for hours, the photographs spread before me, trying to process the reality of my husband's betrayal. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply sat there, something cold and hard forming in the pit of my stomach. When James called to follow up, I was calm and precise. "I need to know who she is," I told him. "Everything about her, name, occupation, history, mutual connections, and I need continued surveillance. I want to know exactly what's happening between them." "Are you planning to confront your husband?" James asked, his tone neutral. "Not yet," I replied. "I need more information first." Over the next week, I learned everything there was to know about Olivia Reed. 28 years old, 5 years younger than me. Event coordinator at the Grand Hamilton Hotel, where Daniel's company had hosted several corporate events over the past year. That's where I'd seen her before, always in the background, efficiently managing details while stealing glances at my husband. Single, no children, originally from Seattle. Moved to our city 3 years ago. Active on social media, though her accounts had recently been set to private. I also learned that their affair had been going on for at least 4 months, possibly longer. They met primarily at the Westview Hotel downtown, always in the same suite. He had given her jewelry, expensive dinners, and apparently, the promise of a future together, all while sleeping beside me each night. All while telling me he loved me. All while I supported his career, managed his household, and believed in our future. I didn't confront Daniel immediately. Something told me to wait, to gather more evidence, to understand the full scope of his betrayal before making my next move. So I became an actress in my own marriage, smiling, supportive, unsuspecting, while privately documenting every lie, every unexplained absence, every detail that would eventually become my armor. And then came the video that confirmed my worst fears. James had managed to capture footage of Daniel and Olivia leaving another doctor's appointment. In the parking lot, away from prying eyes, Daniel knelt down and kissed Olivia's still flat stomach, his face filled with a joy I had once hoped would be directed at me, at our future children. I watched the video 3 times, each viewing solidifying my resolve. The timestamp showed it was from 6 weeks ago. She couldn't be very far along, but far enough for them to know. Far enough for them to be celebrating. I closed my laptop and took a deep breath. Now I understood why Daniel had been so distracted. Lately, why he'd been floating the idea of us taking a break to find ourselves. He wasn't trying to save our marriage. He was trying to find a way out that wouldn't cost him too much, financially or socially. That night, when Daniel came home late again, I greeted him with a glass of his favorite whiskey and a warm smile. "Good day?" I asked, playing the role of devoted wife one last time. "The usual," he replied, loosening his tie. Nothing exciting. I nodded, holding his gaze a moment longer than necessary. I was thinking we should go away this weekend, just the two of us. It's been so long since we've had quality time together. He looked uncomfortable, already formulating his excuse. This weekend? I don't know, Soph. I have that strategy session with the Brentwood account, remember? Another lie. According to James, he and Olivia had reservations at a coastal bed and breakfast 3 hours away. Oh, right, I said, my disappointment perfectly calibrated. Maybe next weekend, then. He gave me a distracted kiss on the cheek. Sure, next weekend. Sounds better. As I watched him walk upstairs to shower away the evidence of his day, I made a promise to myself. I would not be the victim in this story. I would not be the foolish wife who was the last to know. I would take control of this narrative, and when I finally made my move, it would be devastating. 2 days later, the final piece of evidence arrived. James had managed to get access to text messages between Daniel and Olivia. Reading them was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying but impossible to look away from. I can't wait to start our life together, Daniel had written. Just need a little more time to sort things out with Sophia. Do you think she suspects anything? Olivia had asked. No way. Sophia trusts me completely. She always has. That was when I knew exactly how this would end. Not with a quiet divorce or a private confrontation, but with a public reckoning. Daniel and Olivia thought they were so clever, so secretive. They had no idea what was coming. Over the next several weeks, I meticulously gathered every piece of evidence, bank statements, photos, videos, text messages. I consulted with the best divorce attorney in the city, updated our prenuptial agreement with an infidelity clause Daniel had forgotten about, and slowly moved my personal assets to accounts he couldn't access, all while smiling at my husband, across the dinner table, asking about his day, and pretending I didn't know that his world, and Olivia's, was about to come crashing down. And then, the invitation arrived. Olivia had the audacity to send a baby shower invitation to our house, addressed only to Daniel, of course. The floral card announced the celebration of Olivia and Daniel's precious blessing at his parents' home. I called Margaret that evening. Daniel's mother had always treated me like a daughter, and I knew she would be horrified by her son's behavior. I believe you should know something about this baby shower you're hosting, I began gently. The silence on the other end was telling. I'm listening, Margaret finally said, her voice tight. I explained everything, offering to send her copies of the evidence. By the end of our conversation, Margaret was coldly furious. Not at me, but at her son, and the woman who had manipulated her into hosting a celebration of their affair. The invitation says the shower is still happening, I noted carefully. Are you going to cancel it? There was a long pause before Margaret responded. No, she said finally, a steely determination in her voice. I think it should proceed exactly as planned. But I think you should be there, Sophia. And I think it's time my son faces the consequences of his actions. We formulated the plan together. The public revelation, the paternity test, the complete humiliation of both Daniel and Olivia. Margaret would ensure her husband's support and presence, creating an inescapable situation for Daniel. And now, here, we were. The baby shower in full swing, the test samples collected, and the weight of months of deception about to come crashing down on both of them. As the guests whispered nervously among themselves, waiting for the test results to arrive, I maintained my position at the edge of the room, watching Olivia grip the armrest of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept shooting panicked glances at Daniel, who was being coldly interrogated by his father in the corner of the room. A strange calm had settled over me. Whatever happened next, I was prepared. If Daniel was the father, I had already set the divorce proceedings in motion. If he wasn't, well, that would be an interesting twist I hadn't anticipated, but would certainly enjoy watching unfold. Either way, the perfect facade of their relationship was crumbling before my eyes. The carefully constructed lies, The secret meetings, the futures they had planned on the ruins of my marriage. All of it was exposed now, vulnerable to the harsh light of truth. I took another glass of champagne from a passing waiter and allowed myself a small smile. The day wasn't over yet. The best was still to come. As I stood in the corner of the baby shower watching Olivia fidget nervously, I couldn't help but reflect on how we'd reached this point. The memory of the weeks following my discovery of Daniel's affair played through, my mind like a movie I'd watched too many times. After finding concrete evidence of Daniel's relationship with Olivia, I made the conscious decision to play the long game. While every instinct screamed at me to confront him immediately, to throw his clothes onto the front lawn and change the locks, I knew that emotional reaction would only give him the upper hand. Daniel needed to believe he was in control. So my performance began. I watched as Daniel grew more distant with each passing day. Our conversations became shorter, the silences longer. He stopped asking about my day. He stopped touching me altogether. "I think we need to talk," he said one evening in late March. We were sitting at opposite ends of our dining table, the remains of a meal I'd prepared growing cold between us. He hadn't touched his food. "About what?" I asked, taking a sip of wine, even though I knew exactly what was coming. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unable to meet my eyes. "About us. About our marriage." I carefully set down my glass. "I'm listening." He launched into a speech that sounded rehearsed, talking about growing apart and different life paths, and how he never meant to hurt me. It was almost painful, watching him deliver lines that Olivia had clearly fed him. "I made a mistake, Sophia," he finally admitted, still not mentioning Olivia by name. "I've been unfaithful. I allowed tears to fill my eyes, giving him exactly what he expected. The heartbroken wife, shocked by her husband's betrayal." "Who is she?" I whispered. His confession was limited, minimizing the affair's duration and significance. According to Daniel, it was just a few times, something that just happened because he was going through something he couldn't explain. "It's over now," he lied, reaching for my hand across the table. "I ended it. I want to try to fix things between us." Another lie. According to my investigator, Daniel had spent the previous night at Olivia's apartment and had only left an hour before coming home to have this conversation with me. I pulled my hand away, giving him the reaction he needed to assuage his guilt. "I need time," I said, my voice breaking convincingly. "I don't know if I can forgive this." He nodded, looking appropriately remorseful. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll sleep in the guest room." That night, as I lay alone in our bed, I checked the tracking app I'd installed on his phone. He was texting Olivia, no doubt giving her a play-by-play of our conversation, assuring her that the confession had gone as planned. Over the next few days, Daniel performed the role of repentant husband. He brought me flowers, suggested couples therapy, and made an effort to come home at a reasonable hour. All while secretly meeting Olivia whenever he could squeeze her into his schedule. If I hadn't been 3 steps ahead of him, I might have fallen for it. But I knew what was really happening. Olivia was getting impatient. She thought her position was secure enough to push for more, and Daniel was stalling, trying to find a way to leave that wouldn't cost him financially or socially. Then came Olivia's first direct move against me. I was scrolling through Instagram when I saw it, a post from an account I didn't recognize. My investigator had mentioned that Olivia had created a second, private social media profile, and apparently, she'd gotten sloppy with her privacy settings. The photo showed a woman's hand, Olivia's hand with her distinctive silver ring, intertwined with a man's. The caption read, "When you finally find your soulmate, nothing else matters. Secret love, worth the wait." I screenshotted it immediately, knowing she'd realize her mistake and delete it soon. Sure enough, the post disappeared within an hour. But the message was clear. She was staking her claim, getting bolder, testing the waters to see if she could push Daniel to leave me sooner. When Daniel came home that night, I pretended everything was normal. He had no idea I'd seen Olivia's post. No idea I knew he'd spent his lunch hour at her apartment. "How was work?" I asked casually, as he loosened his tie. "Fine," he replied, distracted as usual. "Just busy, lots of meetings." I nodded, the perfect picture of an unsuspecting wife. "I was thinking of inviting your parents over for dinner this weekend. We haven't seen them in a while." Daniel tensed visibly. "This weekend might not be good. I have to go to that conference in Boston, remember?" Another lie. There was no conference in Boston. According to his real schedule, which I'd obtained from his assistant under the pretense of planning a surprise for him, he had nothing scheduled that weekend at all. "Oh, right," I said, feigning disappointment. "Maybe next month then," I continued, gathering evidence, building my case methodically. Every lie, every secret meeting, every unexplained expense. I documented it all. Meanwhile, Daniel grew increasingly careless, convinced that I remained oblivious to his double life. Then Olivia escalated things again. One morning, I received a text from an unknown number. "How does it feel to be the second choice?" I stared at the message, feeling a surge of cold anger. It wasn't enough for her to steal my husband. She wanted to gloat about it too. I didn't respond. Simply saved the number and added the screenshot to my growing file of evidence. The texts continued sporadically over the next few weeks. "He's going to leave you, you know. He says he never really loved you. We laugh about you together." Each message more petty than the last. I never replied, never gave her the satisfaction of knowing she'd gotten to me. But privately, I added a new dimension to my plan. Olivia. Reed wouldn't just lose Daniel. She would be publicly humiliated in the process. Then came the coffee shop incident. I was meeting a friend at Westfield Cafe, a small place downtown I rarely frequented. As I waited in line to order, I felt someone tap my shoulder. "Excuse me, is this seat taken?" I turned to find myself face to face with Olivia. She was even more beautiful up close. Flawless skin, perfect makeup, expensively highlighted hair. Her eyes widened in fake surprise. "Oh, you're Daniel Walker's wife, aren't you? Sophia, right? I'm Olivia Reed. I coordinate events at the Grand Hamilton. I've seen you at a few of the company functions." The performance was masterful, her expression conveying just the right amount of casual recognition, her voice perfectly modulated to sound friendly but not overly familiar. If I hadn't known better, I might have believed the meeting was coincidental. "Yes, I'm Sophia," I replied, matching her tone. "Nice to meet you." "Daniel speaks so highly of you," she continued, her eyes searching my face for any sign that I knew the truth. "He's such a dedicated businessman. You must be so proud." I smiled, determined to play this game better than she could. "Yes, Daniel has always been very committed to whatever he's involved in." Something flickered in her eyes. Disappointment? Perhaps that I wasn't falling apart or showing signs of suspicion. She'd orchestrated this meeting to assess her competition, to see if I was as clueless as Daniel had assured her I was. "Well, it was lovely to bump into you," she said finally, gathering her cup and purse. "Maybe I'll see you at the next company event." "I look forward to it," I replied, watching her walk away with measured steps, her back straight, her confidence only slightly shaken by our encounter. That night, when Daniel came home, I casually mentioned my day. "I had the strangest coincidence today. I ran into one of your event coordinators at a coffee shop. Olivia something?" His coffee cup froze halfway to his lips. "Reed? Olivia Reed?" Yes, that's it, I said, pretending not to notice his reaction. Seems nice. Very pretty. Daniel set down his cup with exaggerated care. Yeah, she's good at her job. The company uses her for most of our events. I nodded, turning back to my book. She mentioned that. Said you speak very highly of me. His relief was palpable. Of course I do. I allowed him to believe that he'd dodged a bullet, that Olivia had successfully navigated a potentially disastrous encounter. Inside, I was adding another checkmark to my mental list. Olivia was getting desperate, taking bigger risks. The situation was escalating exactly as I'd predicted. 2 weeks later, the bomb finally dropped. I was sorting through the mail when my phone lit up with a notification. One of my friends had tagged me in a comment on Instagram. Curious, I opened the app to find myself looking at Olivia's public account. There, for the entire world to see, was a photo of her cradling a small baby bump, the caption reading, "Our little blessing. Can't wait to meet you, little one." And there, clearly visible in the corner of the photo, was Daniel's hand resting possessively on her stomach. The comments section was filled with congratulations, including several from people I knew. People from our social circle who must have immediately recognized Daniel's watch, his distinctive signet ring. My phone began buzzing with messages from friends asking if I was okay, if I knew, if the rumors were true. I ignored them all, focusing instead on what this development meant for my plan. Daniel didn't come home that night, or the next. When he finally showed up 3 days later, he was ashen-faced and carrying a small suitcase. "I'm guessing you've seen the post," he said, standing awkwardly in our foyer like a stranger. I nodded, allowing him to see, for the first time, a glimpse of my genuine anger. "Were you ever going to tell me? Or was I supposed to find out along with everyone else on Instagram?" He had the decency to look ashamed. "I was going to tell you, I didn't know how." "How long?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "About 4 months," he lied. "It had been closer to 8. And now she's pregnant." "Yes." He looked at his feet. "I'm moving in with her. I'll have my lawyer contact you about the divorce." "I want a paternity test," I said flatly. His head snapped up. "What? Why?" "Because I don't trust her," I replied simply. "And if you're going to leave your wife of 10 years for your pregnant mistress, you should at least make sure the baby is yours." Daniel flushed with anger. "Of course it's mine. Olivia wouldn't lie about something like that." I raised an eyebrow. "The woman who's been sleeping with a married man? That's who you're vouching for?" "You don't know her," he snapped. "And you do?" I asked, my voice deceptively calm. "How well do you really know someone you've been sneaking around with for a few months?" "I'm not doing a paternity test. It's insulting." "Suit yourself," I said with a shrug. "But don't say I didn't warn you." He left that night, taking only the essentials. I watched from the window as he loaded his suitcase into his car, feeling strangely detached from the scene. 10 years of marriage ended on our doorstep with barely a goodbye. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Olivia played house, flaunting their relationship now that it was in the open. They appeared together at restaurants, at the theater, at social events where former friends of ours awkwardly tried to navigate the new dynamic. Olivia's pregnancy became more visible, her social media filled with updates about their journey and how meant to be their relationship was. Meanwhile, I continued my preparations. I met with my lawyer, updated my financial arrangements, and put the final touches on my plan. The paternity test was the key, the one thing Daniel continued to refuse whenever I brought it up through our lawyers. "Mrs. Walker," my attorney said during one of our meetings, "are you certain this is the route you want to take? The courts will divide the assets according to the prenuptial agreement. The paternity of your husband's girlfriend's child is irrelevant to your divorce proceedings." I smiled. "It's not about the divorce, James. It's about justice. When the baby shower invitation arrived, addressed to mutual friends who awkwardly forwarded it to me, I knew my moment had finally come. The shower was to be held at the Walker's family home, a detail that surprised me until I received Margaret's call. "Did you know?" she asked without preamble. "About the shower?" "Yes, I just heard. Olivia told me you and Daniel had amicably separated months ago," Margaret explained, her voice tight with anger. "She said you had given them your blessing because you didn't want children. She said you were happy for them." I closed my eyes, absorbing this new level of manipulation. "None of that is true, Margaret." "I know that now," she replied grimly. "Robert and I had lunch with Susan and Thomas Green yesterday. They mentioned how sorry they were about Daniel's affair. That was the first we heard of any affair." "I'm sorry." "You found out this way," I said, genuinely feeling for my in-laws. "Don't be sorry," Margaret said firmly. "But do come to this shower. Robert and I have discussed it, and we think it's time for the truth to come out. All of it. And so here we were. The perfect revenge scenario unfolding exactly as I had planned. As I stood in the Walkers' living room, watching Olivia's confidence crumble while we waited for the paternity test results, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me. Whatever happened next, I had taken back control of my narrative. I caught Olivia staring at me from across the room, her eyes wide with panic. She knew her perfectly constructed world was on the verge of collapse. I raised my champagne glass in her direction, a small toast to the chaos about to unfold. The courier arrived at precisely 5:30 p.m., 3 agonizing hours after the samples had been collected. The party had continued in the most awkward fashion imaginable, with guests huddled in small groups, whispering behind their hands, shooting furtive glances at Daniel, Olivia, and me. Olivia had tried to salvage the situation, opening gifts with forced enthusiasm, and thanking everyone for coming, as if we were all participating in a perfectly normal baby shower. But her hands trembled as she unwrapped tiny onesies and baby blankets, and her smile grew increasingly strained as the hours wore on. Daniel remained in the corner, deep in conversation with his father. From the rigid set of Robert's shoulders and Daniel's defensive posture, it was clear the discussion was not going well. Margaret flitted around the room, the perfect hostess on the surface, though I could see the tension in her eyes whenever she looked at her son. The doorbell's chime cut through the strained atmosphere like a knife. The room fell silent as Margaret went to answer it. She returned moments later, followed by a man in a white lab coat. Dr. William Peterson was a respected geneticist and an old friend of the Walker family, another detail Margaret and I had arranged in advance. His presence lent an air of undeniable legitimacy to the proceedings. "I have the results," he announced, holding up a sealed envelope. Daniel stepped forward, his face pale. "This is ridiculous. We shouldn't be doing this here. I think here is the perfect place," Robert said firmly. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." Olivia clutched the armrest of her chair, her knuckles white. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "tell them to stop this," but it was too late. Dr. Peterson had already broken the seal on the envelope and was unfolding the paper inside. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment everything hinged on. If Daniel was the father, my revenge would be limited to exposing their affair in the most public, humiliating way possible. But if he wasn't, "I'll read the results verbatim," Dr. Peterson said, adjusting his glasses. "Based on the analysis of 16 genetic markers, the probability of paternity is..." The room was so silent you could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. 0%. Dr. Peterson looked up, his expression grave. "The alleged father, Daniel Walker, is excluded as the biological father of the unborn child." For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was as if time itself had frozen. Then Daniel's voice strangled with shock. What? There must be some mistake, Olivia said, her voice rising with panic. She struggled to stand, one hand protectively covering her belly. That's impossible. Daniel is the only one I've been with. The test is conclusive, Dr. Peterson replied, calmly. The genetic markers show no paternal match. Daniel Walker is not the father of this child. The room erupted into chaos. Guests began whispering furiously, some edging toward the door, others openly staring at the unfolding drama. Daniel stood frozen in place, his face a mask of confusion and dawning anger. You told me I was the only one, he finally managed, turning to Olivia. You swore to me. I didn't lie. Olivia cried, tears streaming down her face. The test is wrong. It has to be. I chose that moment to step forward, my composure intact despite the hurricane of emotions whirling inside me. I don't think the test is wrong, Olivia. All eyes turned to me. What do you know about this? Daniel demanded, his voice shaking. I reached into my purse and pulled out another envelope. I know that Olivia has been seeing someone else while she was seeing you. That's a lie, Olivia shouted, her perfect composure completely shattered now. I opened the envelope and removed a stack of photographs, handing them to Daniel. These were taken 2 weeks before she announced her pregnancy. Daniel flipped through the photos, his face growing increasingly pale. They showed Olivia entering and leaving an apartment building on multiple occasions, and in several of them, she was accompanied by a tall, dark-haired man who definitely wasn't Daniel. Who is he? Daniel asked, his voice hollow. I turned to scan the crowd until I found the face I was looking for. Why don't you ask him yourself? He's right here. Every head in the room swiveled to follow my gaze, landing on Ethan Brooks, who stood frozen by the refreshment table, a glass of punch halfway to his lips. Ethan was an associate at Daniel's firm, a junior partner who had always lived in Daniel's. Shadow. I'd only met him a few times at company events, but my investigator had discovered his connection to Olivia several weeks ago. What had started as a casual fling had apparently developed into something more, running parallel to her relationship with Daniel. Ethan? Daniel's voice was a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. You and Olivia? Ethan set down his glass carefully. I didn't know she was with you, he said slowly. She told me she was single. That's not true, Olivia interjected desperately. Ethan, tell them! Tell them you knew about Daniel. But Ethan was already shaking his head. You told me the baby was mine, he said quietly. You said we were going to raise it together. The room collectively gasped. Olivia's deception was unraveling at record speed. So you were sleeping with both of them? Robert's voice cut through the tension, cold with disgust. And lying to both about the paternity of your child? Olivia's face crumpled. She looked wildly around the room, seeking any ally, any escape route. Finding none, she turned on Daniel. You wanted me, she cried, her voice shrill with desperation. You chased me. You told me you loved me. You were going to leave her for me. She jabbed a finger in my direction. Daniel stepped back as if physically struck. I did want you, he admitted, his voice hollow. I thought what we had was real. It was real, Olivia insisted, reaching for him. The baby is yours, Daniel. The test is wrong. Daniel jerked away from her touch. Whose baby is it, Olivia? Mine? Ethan's? Someone else's entirely? She had no answer, just more tears and increasingly incoherent protests. I felt a strange sense of detachment watching the scene unfold. The weeks of planning, the careful gathering of evidence, the strategic timing, it had all led to this moment of perfect, devastating truth. There's more, I said, my voice cutting through Olivia's sobs. I withdrew another file from my purse and handed it to Robert. These are bank statements from the past 6 months. Olivia has been systematically stealing from your company, Daniel. She's been approving fake vendor payments and directing the funds to her personal account. Daniel snatched the file from his father, flipping through the pages with growing horror. Is this true? He demanded, turning to Olivia. But Olivia had nothing left. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. Each revelation, another blow she couldn't defend against. I'd like to add something, Margaret said, stepping forward. All eyes turned to her. When Olivia approached me about hosting this shower, she told me that Sophia had willingly stepped aside because she didn't want children. She said the three of you had come to an amicable arrangement. Daniel's head snapped up. She told you what? That's right, Margaret continued, her voice cold. She's been lying to everyone in this room, manipulating all of us for her own gain. One of Olivia's friends, at least someone I'd assumed was her friend, suddenly stepped forward. She told me Daniel had been separated for over a year when they started dating. Another voice chimed in from the back of the room. She told me Sophia had cheated on Daniel first, and that's why they were getting divorced. The floodgates opened as more guests revealed the various lies Olivia had told them, each one crafted to garner sympathy and paint herself as the victim of circumstances rather than their architect. Throughout it all, I remained still, watching, as my husband's mistress was exposed not just as an adulteress, but as a pathological liar who had played everyone, including Daniel, for a fool. As for Daniel, he looked utterly broken. In the space of 20 minutes, he had lost everything. His pregnant girlfriend was revealed as a liar and a thief. The baby wasn't his, and his betrayal of me had been for nothing. I think, Robert said finally, his voice cutting through the chaos, that this gathering is over. His tone left no room for argument. Olivia, I suggest you leave immediately. As for the rest of you, thank you for coming, but we need some family privacy now. The guests began to disperse, murmuring uncomfortably as they gathered their belongings. Several shot sympathetic glances my way as they left. Others couldn't meet my eyes, perhaps ashamed of how quickly they'd accepted Olivia's narrative. Olivia made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Daniel, please, she begged, grabbing his arm. We can talk about this. I can explain everything. Daniel jerked away from her touch. There's nothing to explain. It's over, Olivia. Whatever game you were playing, you lost. What about the baby? She asked, her voice small. What about it? Daniel replied coldly. It's not mine. Maybe Ethan wants to talk to you about that. Or maybe there's another father out there you haven't mentioned yet. Ethan, who had been silently watching the unfolding. Drama shook his head slowly. I need a paternity test too, he said quietly. I don't trust anything you've told me anymore. Olivia's face crumpled. She looked around the room, seeking any ally, any escape route. Finding none, she grabbed her purse and fled, sobbing as she pushed past the remaining guests. As the door slammed behind her, an eerie silence fell over the room. Daniel, Robert, Margaret, and I stood in the wreckage of what had been a baby shower just hours before, surrounded by scattered gifts, half-empty glasses, and the remnants of Olivia's deception. Daniel turned to me, his expression a mixture of shame, regret, and confusion. Sophia, Don't, I interrupted, holding up a hand. Not now. Not here. You knew, he said softly. You knew she was lying about the baby. I suspected. I corrected. Olivia's stories never quite added up, and she was too eager to announce the pregnancy, too insistent that you leave me immediately. It didn't feel right. Why didn't you tell me? I gave him a long, level look. Would you have believed me? Or would you have assumed I was just a jealous wife trying to sabotage your new relationship? He had no answer for that, which was answer. Enough. Robert cleared his throat. Daniel, we need to talk about what happens next. The company, your position, this mess with Olivia and the potential fraud. Daniel nodded numbly. I know. I'll leave you to it, I said, gathering my purse. I think I've done what I came here to do. As I turned to leave, Margaret caught my arm. Sophia, she said softly, what you did today was extraordinary, painful, but necessary. It wasn't about revenge, I told her, though that wasn't entirely true. It was about truth. Everyone deserved to know who Olivia really is, and what Daniel was willing to throw away for her. Margaret nodded, understanding in her eyes. What will you do now? I smiled, feeling genuinely lighter than I had in months. Now, I'm going to go home, pour myself a glass of wine, and start thinking about what comes next. A life without Daniel. A life where I'm not defined by being the wife he cheated on. You deserve that, she agreed, squeezing my hand. And more. I left the walker home with my head held high, feeling the weight of months of deception and heartbreak finally lifting from my shoulders. Behind me, I could hear Daniel's voice rising in argument with his father, the beginnings of what would undoubtedly be a painful reckoning for the Walker family. But that was no longer my concern. I had exposed the truth. I had reclaimed my dignity. And most importantly, I had shown everyone, especially Daniel, that I was not a victim to be pitied, but a force to be reckoned with. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of Olivia sitting in her car at the end of the street, her head in her hands, her world completely shattered. Just hours ago, she had been the triumphant mistress, the woman who had stolen another's husband. Now she was exposed, humiliated, and alone. I felt no pity for her. She had made her choices, just as Daniel had made his. And now they were both facing the consequences while I was driving toward a future that, for the first time in months, felt full of possibility rather than pain. The paternity test had changed everything, not just for Olivia, but for all of us. And as painful as this journey had been, I couldn't help but feel that justice had finally been served. The fallout from the baby shower continued well into the next week. I had expected to feel triumphant after exposing Olivia's lies and watching her world collapse, but instead I felt strangely hollow. The victory I'd imagined for months had come and gone, leaving me with an unexpected emptiness. I was sitting in my home office 3 days after the shower, reviewing divorce papers with my attorney, when my phone pinged with a news alert from our local business journal. Walker Technologies under investigation. Fraud allegations surface. So it had begun. Robert hadn't wasted any time addressing the financial discrepancies I'd uncovered. I skimmed the article, which carefully avoided naming Olivia directly, but mentioned financial irregularities discovered by the company's internal audit team. Robert was protecting the family reputation while still taking action, a classic Walker move. My phone rang moments later. It was Margaret. Have you seen the news? She asked without preamble. Just now, I replied, leaning back in my chair. Robert moved quickly. He had no choice. Once we verified your information, the board insisted on a full investigation. She paused. Sophia, I need to ask you something. How long have you known about Olivia's activities with the company finances? About 3 weeks, I admitted. My investigator discovered it while looking into her background. I was waiting for the right moment to reveal it. And that moment was the baby shower, Margaret said, her tone unreadable. It seemed fitting, I replied. Maximum impact. Margaret was silent for a long moment. I underestimated you all these years, Sophia. We all did. Most people do, I said, simply. Daniel is devastated, she continued. Not just about Olivia and the baby, but about the company. The board is considering suspending him while they investigate how much he knew about the fraud. I felt a twinge of something. Not quite sympathy, but perhaps a ghost of the affection I once had for the man I married. He didn't know, I said, confidently. Daniel can be blind when it comes to people he cares about, but he's not dishonest. That's what Robert believes too, but the board needs proof. She sighed heavily. This is such a mess. I'm sorry for my part in it, I said, though. We both knew I wasn't, not really. Don't be, Margaret replied firmly. You didn't create this situation. Daniel and Olivia did. You just exposed it in the most dramatically effective way possible. After we hung up, I sat staring at the wall for a long while, contemplating what came next. The revenge I'd planned for months was complete, yet I felt unsettled, as if there was more to this story that I didn't yet understand. My phone rang again. This time it was James Fisher, my investigator. Mrs. Walker, he said, his voice tense. I've found something you need to see. An hour later, I was sitting in his office, staring at a series of documents spread across his desk. I kept digging into Olivia Reed's background after the baby shower, James explained. Something about her story never quite added up to me. What do you mean? I asked, picking up the top file. Well, for starters, Olivia Reed isn't her real name. I looked up sharply. What? James tapped one of the documents. Her real name is Olivia Reeves. She changed it legally 4 years ago, right before she moved here from Seattle. Why? That's where it gets interesting. James shuffled through his papers, pulling out a newspaper clipping. Olivia Reeves was implicated in a similar scheme at her previous job, a marketing firm in Seattle. She was dating one of the executives, while simultaneously embezzling from the company. Charges were filed, but then mysteriously dropped. I scanned the article, which featured a grainy photo of a younger Olivia being escorted out of an office building. So, this is a pattern for her. More than a pattern, James replied, handing me another file. It's her entire modus operandi. I've found at least 3 instances over the past decade where she's targeted wealthy businessmen, initiated affairs, and then used her access to siphon money from their companies. And the pregnancy? I asked, a new understanding dawning. James shook his head. That appears to be a new twist. But it's consistent with escalation patterns for this type of con artist. Each scheme gets more elaborate, more ambitious. I sat back, absorbing this information. So Daniel wasn't special. He was just a mark? Exactly, and not her only one. James flipped to another section of his report. While she was seeing Daniel, and apparently this Ethan person, she was also meeting regularly with Thomas Blackwell. The name hit me like a physical blow. Thomas Blackwell from Meridian Capital. James nodded. One of Walker Technology's biggest investors. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. She wasn't just stealing from Daniel's company. She was positioning herself to get insider information about Meridian's investments too. That would be my assessment, James agreed. Ms. Reed, or Reeves, was playing a much bigger game than anyone realized. I gathered the files, my mind racing. I need copies of all of this. Already prepared, James said, handing me a thumb drive. What are you going to do with it? I slipped the drive into my purse. I'm not sure yet. But Olivia needs to be stopped before she targets someone else. As I drove home, I thought about Daniel. How thoroughly he'd been deceived. How completely he'd fallen for Olivia's act. Part of me wanted to let him suffer. To let him stew in the misery he'd created for himself. But another part, a part I thought had died when I discovered his affair, felt a responsibility to reveal the full truth. Not for his sake, but for justice, for closure. I was pulling into my driveway when my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Sophia? It's Ethan Brooks, I tensed. Ethan, what can I do for you? I need to talk to you, he said, his voice strained. About Olivia. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Can we meet somewhere? I hesitated, weighing the risks. The cafe at the West Side Library. 1 hour. I'll be there. I arrived early, choosing a table with a clear view of the entrance. Ethan arrived precisely on time, looking haggard and anxious. He slid into the seat across from me, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Thank you for meeting me, he began. What's this about, Ethan? I kept my tone neutral, revealing nothing. He glanced around nervously before leaning forward. Olivia came to see me last night. She was desperate. Said she needed money to leave town. And she told me things. About Daniel, about the company. He swallowed hard. About you. What kind of things? She said you've been obsessed with her for months, that you planted evidence and manipulated the paternity test results, that you're trying to frame her for financial crimes she didn't commit. I couldn't help it. I laughed. The absurdity of her claims was almost impressive. And you believed her? Ethan shifted uncomfortably. No, not really. But she was convincing. She was crying, showing me texts supposedly from you threatening her. Fake, obviously. I know that now. He pulled out his phone, sliding it across the table. Because then she sent me these after I refused to give her money. The screen showed a series of increasingly threatening messages, supposedly from Ethan, demanding she abort the baby and leave town. Messages he clearly hadn't sent. She's desperate, I observed, sliding the phone back. Cornered people often are. There's more, Ethan said, lowering his voice. She admitted the baby might not be mine either. Said there was a third man involved. Someone powerful. Thomas Blackwell, I thought immediately, but kept my face impassive. Why are you telling me this? Ethan looked genuinely pained. Because I'm ashamed of my role in all this. I knew Daniel was married. I should have stayed away from Olivia when I realized she was involved with him. Yes, you should have. But also because I'm worried about what she might do next. She's not stable, Sophia. The way she talked last night, she's planning something. I considered this information carefully. Has she contacted Daniel since the shower? Ethan nodded. Multiple times, according to what she told me. He's blocking her. Calls, but she's relentless. And the company? Has she tried to access the building? Security turned her away twice yesterday. He frowned. How did you know? Instead of answering, I reached into my purse and pulled out a business card. Call this number. Ask for James. Fisher. Tell him everything you just told me, and anything else you know about Olivia. He'll know what to do with the information. Ethan took the card, looking confused. Who is he? Someone who can help make sure Olivia doesn't hurt anyone else. After Ethan left, I sat for a while, piecing together this new information with what I already knew. Olivia wasn't just running a simple con. She was methodical, adaptable, and increasingly dangerous. The more her plans unraveled, the more unpredictable she became. I needed to warn Daniel. The thought surprised me. After months of planning his downfall, I now felt compelled to protect him. Not out of lingering affection, but out of a sense of justice. Daniel deserved to suffer for his betrayal, but Olivia's machinations went beyond simple revenge. This was criminal, potentially dangerous. I called his number before I could talk myself out of it. To my surprise, he answered on the second ring. Sophia? His voice was wary, exhausted. We need to talk, I said simply. About Olivia. I don't think I can handle any more revelations right now, he replied, a bitter edge to his voice. This isn't about the past. It's about what she might do next. There was a long pause. Where? Your father's lake house. 1 hour. I'll be there. The Walker family lake house had always been a sanctuary of sorts, a place removed from the pressures of business and society. Daniel and I had spent our early anniversaries there, planning our future while watching sunsets from the deck. Now it would serve as the setting for what might be our final conversation. I arrived first, using the key Margaret had given me years ago. The house smelled musty, unlived in. I turned on a few lights and waited in the great room, watching the lake through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The water was still, reflecting the cloudy sky like a perfect mirror. Daniel arrived exactly on time, looking like he'd aged years in the days since the baby shower. His eyes were hollow, his normally immaculate appearance disheveled. He stopped short when he saw me, as if suddenly uncertain about the wisdom of this meeting. "Sit down, Daniel," I said, gesturing to the chair across from me. "You look terrible." He gave a humorless laugh as he sank into the chair. "Thanks for noticing. Have you spoken to Olivia since the shower?" He shook his head. "She's called, texted, even came to the apartment. I've blocked her number and told the doorman not to let her up." "Good. Keep it that way." I pulled out the files James had given me, spreading them on the coffee table between us. "Olivia isn't who you think she is. She's not even who I thought she was." Daniel stared at the documents, not reaching for them. "What do you mean?" "Her name isn't Olivia Reed. It's Olivia Reeves. She's run this same con in at least 3 other cities, targeting wealthy businessmen, initiating affairs, and embezzling from their companies." The color drained from Daniel's face. "That's not possible." "Look at the evidence," I urged, pushing the files closer to him. "Police reports, newspaper articles, financial records. She's a professional con artist, Daniel, and you weren't her only target here." Reluctantly, he began looking through the papers. I watched his expression change from disbelief to shock, to a sort of horrified understanding as he absorbed the truth about the woman he'd thrown away our marriage for. "Thomas Blackwell?" he said finally, looking up from the files. "She was seeing Blackwell too?" I nodded. "While she was seeing you and Ethan. I believe she was using you for access to Walker Technologies and using Blackwell for information about Meridian's investments." Daniel put his head in his hands. "I'm such a fool." "Yes," I agreed, without malice. "You are. But that's not why I'm here." He looked up, a flash of the old Daniel, sharp, focused, visible in his eyes. "You think she's planning something. I know she is. She's desperate, exposed, and running out of options. That makes her dangerous. To who? Me? The company?" "Both," I said firmly. "You need to warn your father, increase security at the office and your apartment, and be extremely careful about what you eat, drink, or sign for the foreseeable future." Daniel straightened, alarmed. "You think she'd try to hurt me physically?" "I think she's capable of anything at this point. She's facing potential criminal charges, her reputation is destroyed, and she's pregnant with a child whose paternity is unclear. People have done terrible things under less pressure." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the lake. "Why are you doing this, Sophia?" he finally asked. "Why warn me? After everything I did to you, you should want to see me suffer." I considered the question carefully. I did want that, for a long time. I planned very meticulously to make sure you would face the consequences of your actions. But this, I gestured to the files, goes beyond what even you deserve. So this is, what? Mercy? Justice, I corrected. Olivia needs to be stopped, and you need to understand exactly what happened. Not just that she cheated on you or lied about the baby, but that you were targeted from the beginning. That none of it was real. The pain that flashed across his face was almost satisfying. Almost. Was any of it real? He asked quietly. And I knew he wasn't talking about Olivia anymore. I met his gaze steadily. What we had was real, Daniel. Until you decided it wasn't enough. He flinched as if I'd struck him. I'm sorry, he said, the words seemingly pulled from somewhere deep inside him. I know it doesn't change anything, but I am genuinely sorry for what I did to you. I nodded, acknowledging his apology without accepting it. You should go. Take the files. Show them to your father and the board. They need to know what they're dealing with. Daniel gathered the documents slowly, his movements heavy with the weight of everything he'd learned. At the door, he paused, looking back at me. What about you? He asked. If Olivia is as dangerous as you say, you could be at risk too. I smiled thinly. I can take care of myself. I've been doing it for months now. After he left, I stayed at the lake house for a while, watching darkness settle over the water. There was a strange symmetry to this day, meeting Daniel in this place that had once meant so much to us, but as virtual strangers now. The woman who had warned him today was not the same woman who had stood by him unquestioningly for 10 years. And the man who had walked out the door was not the same man I had married. We had both been transformed by his betrayal and its aftermath. I couldn't decide if that was tragic or simply inevitable. My phone buzzed with a text from James. OR. Purchased one-way ticket to Mexico City, departing tomorrow at 11:30 a.m., so Olivia was planning to run. I wasn't surprised, but I doubted she would get very far. I texted back, alert Walker security and the authorities. Then I gathered my things and left the lake house, not looking back. That chapter of my life was closing. It was time to focus on what came next. Daniel didn't make it to the office the next morning. According to Margaret, who called me around 9, he had been up all night with Robert and the company's legal team, going through the files I'd given him and formulating a plan to address the Olivia situation. They've contacted the authorities, she told me. The police are looking for her now. She won't be easy to find, I warned. She's resourceful. Well, she won't be leaving the country. Robert made sure of that. He has friends in federal law enforcement who flagged her passport. I smiled. The Walker family connections were extensive and powerful. If anyone could ensure Olivia faced consequences, it was Robert. How's Daniel holding up? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Not well, she finally admitted. The board suspended him yesterday, pending the investigation. He's taking it hard. He'll be cleared once they understand Olivia's role, I assured her. Yes, but the damage to his reputation, to his confidence, she sighed. He's so ashamed, Sophia. Not just about the company, but about what he did to you. How easily he was manipulated. I felt a complicated mixture of satisfaction and pity. Daniel had always been proud, confident to the point of arrogance sometimes. To see him humbled was what I had wanted for months. Yet hearing about his suffering brought me less pleasure than I'd anticipated. He made his choices, I said. More, to remind myself, than Margaret. Now he's facing the consequences. Yes, he did, Margaret agreed. And I want you to know that Robert and I don't blame you for any of this. You did what you had to do to protect yourself and expose the truth. Thank you for saying that. After we hung up, I found myself restless, unable to focus on work or anything else. The strange emptiness I'd felt since the baby shower persisted, a void where my anger and determination had been for so long. I decided to go for a drive to clear my head. Without consciously choosing a destination, I found myself heading toward the downtown area where Walker Technologies had its headquarters. I parked across the street, watching employees come and go from the gleaming building Daniel had been so proud of. As I sat there, my phone rang. Unknown number again. Hello? I answered cautiously. Is this Sophia Walker? A woman's voice, unfamiliar. Yes. Who's this? My name is Detective Lisa Morgan with the Financial Crimes Unit. I understand you have information about Olivia Reeves. I sat up straighter. Yes, quite a bit of information, actually. I'd like to meet with you as soon as possible. We've been building a case against Ms. Reeves for several weeks now, and your input could be valuable. I agreed to meet her at the police station in an hour. As I started my car, a strange calm settled over me. This was the final piece, official justice for Olivia's crimes. Not just my personal revenge, but a reckoning through proper channels. The interview with Detective Morgan lasted nearly 3 hours. I shared everything I knew about Olivia, her relationship with Daniel, her connection to Ethan, her suspicious financial activities, and the evidence my investigator had uncovered about her past schemes. This is extremely helpful, Morgan said, as she reviewed my documentation. We've been tracking Ms. Reeves since her activities in Seattle, but she's been careful, covering her tracks well. Your information fills in several gaps for us. Do you know where she is now? I asked. Morgan shook her head. We're still looking. She didn't show up for her flight to Mexico City this morning, and she's not at her apartment. She's hiding somewhere. I'm used, regrouping, planning her next move. We'll find her, Morgan assured me. People like Ms. Reeves eventually make mistakes, especially when they're desperate. As I was leaving the station, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Just you and me. 1 hour. The Westview Hotel, room 718. Olivia. It had to be. My heart raced as I considered my options. Going alone to meet desperate. Cornered. Olivia seemed foolish, but this might be the only chance to get answers to questions that had been haunting me. I texted James, giving him the details of the meeting and instructing him to contact Detective Morgan if he didn't. Hear from me within 2 hours. Then I headed to the Westview. The hotel was upscale but discreet, the perfect place for affairs and clandestine meetings. I'd never been inside before, though I knew from James's reports that this was where Daniel and Olivia had often met. Room 718 was at the end of a quiet hallway. I stood outside the door for a moment, gathering my courage, then knocked firmly. Olivia opened the door immediately, as if she'd been waiting right behind it. She looked terrible, her normally perfect hair limp and unwashed, her expensive clothes wrinkled, her eyes red-rimmed and wild. You came, she said, sounding genuinely surprised. I wasn't sure you would. I'm curious by nature, I replied, staying in the doorway. What do you want, Olivia? She stepped back, gesturing for me to enter. Please, I just want to talk. I scanned the room before stepping inside, alert for any sign of a trap or weapon. The suite was a disaster, clothes strewn everywhere, service trays piled with half-eaten food, empty wine bottles on the floor. Hiding out? I asked, keeping my distance. Olivia laughed bitterly. Trying to, but I'm running out of options. She collapsed onto the sofa, looking utterly defeated. You've won, Sophia. Completely and thoroughly. Are you happy now? This isn't about winning or losing, I said calmly. It's about truth. Truth, she repeated, spitting the word like a curse. Your truth or mine? There's only one truth, Olivia. Or should I call you Olivia Reeves? She flinched visibly. So you know about that too. I know everything. Seattle, Portland, Chicago, all your previous marks, all your previous schemes. She was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands. Then you know why I did it. For money, I said flatly. For greed. For survival, she corrected, looking up at me with unexpected intensity. You have no idea what it's like to have nothing, to be nothing. To know that your only value in this world is what you can extract from people who have everything. Save the sob story, I said, unmoved. You targeted my husband, destroyed my marriage, and tried to steal from his company. Your motivations don't interest me. But they should, she insisted, leaning forward. Because you and I are more alike than you think, Sophia. I laughed incredulously. We are nothing alike. Really? She raised an eyebrow. Look at how methodically you planned your revenge, how patiently you gathered evidence, how perfectly you orchestrated my downfall. Those aren't the actions of some heartbroken wife acting on emotion. Those are the calculations of a strategist, just like me. Her words hit uncomfortably close to home. Over the past months, I had indeed become calculating, focused solely on bringing Daniel and Olivia down, but that didn't make me like her. The difference, I said slowly, is that I was protecting myself from people who betrayed me. You were the betrayer from the start. Olivia shrugged, conceding the point. Fair enough, but admit it. Part of you admires what I almost pulled off. What do you want from me, Olivia? I asked, tired of her games. Why am I here? Her facade cracked then, the desperation showing through. I need help getting out of town. Money, a car, something. Everyone's looking for me. I can't use my cards, my accounts are frozen. You're asking me for help? I couldn't hide my astonishment. After everything you've done, who else can I ask? She replied simply. Daniel won't take my calls. Ethan's blocked my number. Thomas Blackwell has his security team looking for me. And what could you possibly offer me in return? She hesitated, then reached for her purse, pulling out a flash drive. Information about Daniel. Things you don't know yet. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of information? About why he really turned to me. She held the drive just out of my reach. About the plans he had that didn't include you. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception. You're lying, trying to manipulate me one last time. Maybe, she acknowledged with a small shrug. Or maybe there's more to this story than you've discovered. Help me get out of town, and you can find out. For a brief moment, I was tempted. What if there was something I'd missed? Some deeper betrayal I hadn't uncovered? But then I remembered who I was dealing with. Olivia was a professional manipulator. This was just another con, a desperate last attempt to use me as she'd used everyone else. No deal, I said firmly, turning toward the door. The police are looking for you. I suggest you turn yourself in before things get worse. They're going to blame everything on me, she said, her voice rising. Daniel, the company, everyone. They'll make me the villain and wash their hands of any responsibility. I paused with my hand on the doorknob. Aren't you the villain, Olivia? Not the only one. She was on her feet now, her composure cracking. Daniel knew what I was doing with the company finances. He helped me, Sophia. He was planning to take the money and run. With me, not you. I turned to face her. You're lying. Am I? Her eyes gleamed with desperate intensity. Why do you think he never questioned those transactions? Why do you think he gave me access to those accounts in the first place? Because he trusted you, I replied. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Daniel had been careless in his affair, but he was meticulous about business. It was strange that he hadn't noticed the financial irregularities. Olivia sensed my uncertainty. Help me get out of town, and I'll give you proof. Emails, text messages, recordings of our conversations about the plan. I took a deep breath, centering myself. If you have evidence that Daniel was involved in financial crimes, you should give it to the police. It might help your case. You think they'll believe me over a walker? She scoffed. The family has half the city in their pocket. Then I guess you're out of options, I said, opening the door. Goodbye, Olivia. Wait, she called desperately. What if I told you he was never going to give you children, that he had a vasectomy 3 years ago without telling you?" I froze. "That's right," she continued, pressing her advantage. "He knew how badly you wanted a family. He just didn't want one with you. He told me all about it, how he kept making excuses, telling you to wait for the right time, when all along he knew it would never happen." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Daniel and I had indeed discussed children, planned for them. We'd agreed to wait until his business was more established, but he'd always said he wanted a family just as much as I did. "You're lying," I said, again, but my voice lacked conviction. "Check his medical records," Olivia suggested. "Or better yet, ask him directly. Watch his face when you do." I needed to leave, to get away from her poisonous words and the doubts they were sowing. "The police will be here soon," I said, stepping into the hallway. I called them before I came up. It was a bluff, but Olivia's panicked expression told me she believed it. "You bitch," she hissed, her mask of desperation replaced by pure hatred. "You set me up." "Goodbye, Olivia," I said again, closing the door on her furious face. I made it to the elevator before my composure cracked. The possibility that Daniel had secretly undergone a vasectomy while knowing how much I wanted children was a new kind of betrayal, one I hadn't been prepared for. It struck at the heart of our relationship, at the future we'd planned together. But was it true? Or was it just another of Olivia's manipulations? I drove home in a daze, Olivia's words echoing in my mind. As much as I wanted to dismiss them entirely, there had been moments over the years when Daniel's reluctance to start a family had seemed strange. His constant refrain of, not yet, despite the business growing more successful each year. His discomfort whenever friends announced pregnancies or invited us to their children's birthday parties. I needed to know the truth, one way or another. Instead of going home, I found myself driving to Daniel's apartment, the new place he'd moved into after leaving our house. I hadn't been there before, but I knew the address from the divorce papers. The doorman called up to announce me, and after a long pause, Daniel agreed to let me come up. He was waiting at the open door when the elevator arrived at his floor, looking confused and wary. "Sophia, what's going on? Is it about Olivia?" I brushed past him into the apartment, which was sparsely furnished and impersonal. "I just came from seeing her." His eyes widened in alarm. "You saw Olivia? Where? When?" "At the Westview Hotel. She reached out to me, wanted my help escaping town." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, visibly agitated. "That was incredibly dangerous. She's desperate, cornered. She could have hurt you." "She tried to hurt me with words instead," I said, turning to face him directly. "She told me things, Daniel. Things I need you to either confirm or deny." He tensed, wariness replacing concern. "What kind of things? Did you know about the financial fraud? Were you helping her?" "No," he said immediately, emphatically. "Absolutely not. I had no idea what she was doing until you exposed it at the shower." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception. He seemed genuinely offended by the suggestion. "She also said you had a vasectomy 3 years ago, without telling me." The color drained from his face, and his eyes darted away from mine. In that moment, I knew it was true. "Sophia, you did, didn't you?" My voice was steady despite the turmoil inside me. "All those conversations we had about starting a family someday, all those times I brought it up and you said, 'Not yet.' You knew it would never happen." Daniel sank onto the couch, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "It wasn't like that. I was going to tell you." "When?" I demanded, anger finally breaking through my composure. "After how many more years of lying to my face?" "I didn't know how to tell you," he admitted, his voice hollow. "I knew how much having children meant to you. But the truth is, I never wanted them. Not really. I thought maybe I would change my mind over time, but I didn't. And then the business was taking off, and it seemed like the perfect excuse. So you made a permanent decision without consulting me, your wife? Without giving me this chance to decide if a childless marriage was something I could accept? He had no answer for that. That's the cruelest thing you've done, Daniel, I said quietly. Worse than the affair. You stole my choice. I'm sorry, he whispered. And for once I believed him. Not that it mattered now. I needed to know, I said, gathering my purse. Now I do. As I moved toward the door, Daniel called after me. Did Olivia say anything else about where she might go? I paused, considering whether to mention the flash drive, the alleged evidence she claimed to have. But something held me back. No, nothing useful. Outside, in the safety of my car, I finally allowed the tears to come. Not for the loss of my marriage. I'd mourned that already. But for the children I'd never have with the man I thought I knew. For the future that had been a lie all along. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morgan. We have Olivia Reeves in custody. Thank you for your help. So they'd found her after all. I wondered if she'd run after our conversation, or if they'd tracked her to the hotel independently. Either way, it was over. Olivia would face justice for her crimes. Daniel would suffer the consequences of his betrayal. And I would move forward. Alone, but wiser. Stronger for having survived this crucible of deception and pain. As I drove away from Daniel's building for the last time, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The revenge I'd planned so meticulously was complete, with an outcome more devastating than even I had anticipated. Daniel had lost everything. His wife, his reputation, his position at the company, and now even the facade of being an innocent victim in Olivia's schemes. He truly had nothing left. No wife who believed in him, no mistress who loved him, no parents who respected him, no company that trusted him. He'd lost it all through his own choices, his own lies, his own betrayal. I should have felt triumphant. This was exactly what I'd wanted. To see Daniel suffer as I had suffered, to watch his perfect life crumble to dust. But instead, I felt only a quiet sense of closure, of a chapter finally ending. As I drove through the city streets toward home, my home now, not ours, I thought about what came next. The divorce would be finalized soon. Daniel wouldn't contest anything now. He had no leverage, no moral high ground. The company would recover from the scandal eventually. Margaret and Robert would stand by their son despite their disappointment, helping him rebuild some semblance of a career and life. And me? I had possibilities stretching before me like an open road. I could restart my interior design business, perhaps travel for a while, reconnect with friends I'd neglected during my marriage. I could date again if I wanted to, or I could simply enjoy my independence, the freedom to make choices without considering anyone else's needs or wants. For the first time in months, I felt something like hope stir inside me. Not happiness, not yet. The wounds were still too fresh for that. But potential. Possibility. A future that belonged entirely to me. 2 weeks after my confrontation with Daniel about the vasectomy, I sat in my attorney's office watching him sign the final divorce papers. His hand trembled slightly as he scrawled, his signature on the last page, finalizing the end of our 10-year marriage. That's everything, my attorney, Rebecca, said, gathering the documents. I'll file these today. The judge should approve them within the week, given the circumstances. Daniel nodded silently, not meeting my eyes. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, wearing a suit that hung loosely on his frame. The last few weeks had clearly taken their toll. Is there anything else? He asked, his voice hoarse. No, I replied. That's everything. He finally looked up at me. 1,000 unspoken words in his gaze. Sophia, I raised my hand, stopping him. Don't. We've said everything that needs to be said. He swallowed hard, then nodded and rose to leave. At the door, he paused, turning back. I hope you find happiness, he said quietly. You deserve it. Then he was gone, walking out of my life as easily as he had walked out of our marriage, though, this time, there was no mistress waiting with open arms, no fantasy future to escape into, just the cold reality of consequences. Rebecca smiled at me sympathetically. You did well, she said. The settlement is extremely favorable. The house, half of his assets, the art collection. He didn't fight for any of it. He's in no position to fight, I replied. In truth, I'd expected the process to be more contentious, despite Daniel's weakened position. But he'd surrendered completely, accepting my terms without negotiation. I suspected guilt played a larger role than strategy in his decision. What will you do now? Rebecca asked, closing her briefcase. It was a question I'd been pondering for weeks. What does one do after achieving the perfect revenge? After watching your unfaithful husband and his manipulative mistress lose everything? I'm not sure yet, I admitted. Travel, maybe. Restart. My design business. I have options. Well, you certainly have the financial freedom to do whatever you want, she observed. Not many divorces end with the wife in such a strong position. Not many wives spend months meticulously planning their husband's downfall, I thought, but didn't say. As I left Rebecca's office, I felt strangely light, as if gravity had less hold on me. The divorce papers were signed. Olivia was in custody, awaiting trial, denied bail due to her flight risk. Daniel was suspended from his company pending the investigation into Olivia's financial fraud. The game was over, and I had won. I drove home, the afternoon sun warming my face through the car window. For months, my entire existence had revolved around gathering evidence, planning confrontations, orchestrating Daniel and Olivia's public humiliation. Now that it was done, I found myself in unfamiliar territory, a life without purpose or direction. That evening, as I poured myself a glass of wine and settled onto my patio to watch the sunset, my phone rang. Margaret Walker's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated before answering. While Margaret had been supportive through the entire ordeal, even siding with me against her son, I wasn't sure what place she would have in my life moving forward. Hello. Margaret? I answered, keeping my tone neutral. Sophia, dear. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. What can I do for you? She paused, and I could almost see her gathering her thoughts, choosing her words carefully. I wanted to check on you. Daniel mentioned he signed the papers today. Yes, it's done. The divorce should be final within the week. How are you feeling? The genuine concern in her voice caught me off guard. I'm fine, I said, realizing as I spoke that it was true. It's strange, but I feel more relieved than anything. That's understandable. You've been through so much. Another pause. Sophia, Robert and I would like to see you if you're open to it. Perhaps dinner next week? The invitation surprised me. Are you sure that's appropriate, given everything? Dear, you were family to us for 10 years. Daniel's mistakes don't change how we feel about you. I felt a lump form in my throat. Throughout my marriage, Margaret and Robert had treated me like a daughter, welcoming me into their family with open arms. Losing that connection had been one of the many painful casualties of Daniel's betrayal. I'd like that, I said softly. After we hung up, I sat watching the colors of the sunset deepen, reflecting on how differently everything had turned out from what I'd imagined when I first discovered Daniel's affair. I had expected to feel vindicated, triumphant, watching Daniel and Olivia suffer the consequences of their actions. And I did, to some extent. But there was also a hollow feeling, a sense that revenge, however meticulously planned and perfectly executed, couldn't heal the deeper wounds of betrayal. My phone pinged with a news alert. Walker Technologies Board clears Daniel Walker of involvement in financial fraud. So Daniel had been officially exonerated. The investigation must have concluded that he'd had no knowledge of Olivia's embezzlement scheme. It was what I had expected. Daniel was many things, but he wasn't a thief. Another ping followed. Olivia Reeves pleads guilty to multiple fraud charges. I opened the article, scanning it quickly. Olivia had accepted a plea deal, admitting to embezzlement, identity fraud, and several other charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. According to the article, she would likely serve between 4 and 7 years in prison. Justice, of a sort. Later that evening, as I was getting ready for bed, my doorbell rang. It was nearly 11 p.m., too late for casual visitors. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Daniel stood on my porch, swaying slightly. I considered ignoring him, but curiosity won out. I opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain latched. "What do you want, Daniel?" "Can I come in?" His words were slightly slurred. "Please, Sophia. I need to talk to you." "You're drunk," I observed flatly. "Not drunk. Just had a few. Please, 5 minutes." Against my better judgment, I unlatched the chain and stepped back, allowing him inside. He stumbled slightly as he entered, confirming my assessment of his state. "Make it quick," I said, crossing my arms. "It's late." Daniel ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I got cleared today. By the board. They know I didn't help Olivia. Steal from the company. I saw the news. Congratulations." "Yeah, well..." He laughed bitterly. "They still don't want me back. Too much reputational damage," they said. My own father agreed with them. I didn't respond. Daniel's career problems were no longer my concern. "I've lost everything, Sophia," he continued, his voice breaking. "The company, my reputation, you, everything I care about. You lost those things through your own choices," I reminded him, keeping my voice steady. "No one forced you to cheat. No one forced you to lie to me for years about wanting children." He flinched as if I'd struck him. I know that. I keep thinking about what my life would be like if I hadn't met Olivia. If I had just been honest with you from the beginning about not wanting kids. We probably would have divorced anyway, I said honestly. Children were always important to me, but it would have been a clean break, without all this pain and humiliation. Daniel nodded, staring at his feet. "You deserved better," he whispered. "You always deserved better than me." For a moment, I felt a flicker of pity for this broken man who had once been my husband. Daniel had always been proud, confident to the point of arrogance. Seeing him so utterly defeated brought me less satisfaction than I'd anticipated. "Why? Are you here, Daniel? What do you want from me?" He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and desperate. "I don't know. Forgiveness, maybe? A second chance? I know I don't deserve either one, but I had to try. I can't eat, can't sleep. All I can think about is how badly I messed up and how much I hurt you." "You're right," I said calmly. "You don't deserve forgiveness, and you definitely don't deserve a second chance." He flinched again but nodded. "I understand." "No, I don't. Think you do." I moved toward the door, signaling that our conversation was ending. The man I married, the man I loved, never existed. He was a fiction, a mask you wore while secretly making life-altering decisions without me. I could never trust you again, Daniel. And without trust, there's nothing. "I know," he whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I know that. I just thought..." You thought what? That your remorse would erase what you did? That I'd be so moved by your suffering that I'd welcome you back? I shook my head. You need to leave. He moved toward the door, then paused, reaching into his pocket. I almost forgot. This came to the apartment for you. He handed me a small envelope. It's from the laboratory that did the paternity test. Probably just formal documentation or something. I took the envelope, surprised. Thank you. Daniel hesitated at the threshold, looking back at me one last time. For what it's worth, Sophia, loving you was the one real thing in my life. I just wasn't worthy of your love in return. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night, leaving me alone with the envelope and his parting words. I sat at my kitchen counter, turning the envelope over in my hands. It was indeed from the laboratory that had performed the paternity test at the baby shower. Why would they be sending me documentation? I hadn't been the one to commission the test. Curious, I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a formal letter addressed to me. Dear Mrs. Walker, it began. During our routine quality control process, we discovered a concerning anomaly with the paternity test performed on Daniel Walker and the unborn, child of Olivia Reed, also known as Olivia Reeves. Upon re-examination of the samples, we determined that the original test results were compromised due to contamination in our laboratory. My heart began to race as I continued reading. Our follow-up testing, conducted with proper protocols, indicates that contrary to our initial findings, Daniel Walker cannot be excluded as the biological father of the unborn child. In fact, the probability of paternity is 99.98%, strongly suggesting that he is indeed the father. I set the letter down, my hands shaking. Daniel was the father of Olivia's baby. The test that had triggered her downfall, that had exposed her relationship with Ethan, that had set in motion the complete unraveling of her schemes. It had been wrong, or had it? A strange suspicion began to form in my mind. I picked up my phone and dialed James Fisher's number. Mrs. Walker, he answered on the second ring. Is everything all right? James, I need to ask you something important. The laboratory that performed the paternity test at the shower, did you have any connection to them? There was a long pause. Why do you ask? I just received a letter saying the test was contaminated, that Daniel is actually the father of Olivia's baby. Another pause, longer. This time, Mrs. Walker, Sophia, when you hired me, you asked me to help you expose the truth about your husband's affair, to gather evidence that would hold up in court if necessary. Yes, and you did that, brilliantly. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that you wanted more than evidence. You wanted justice, vindication. A chill ran down my spine. What are you saying, James? He sighed heavily. The laboratory that performed the test is owned by my brother-in-law. When you mentioned wanting to demand a paternity test at the shower, I saw an opportunity to ensure the outcome would be in your favor. You falsified the test? My voice was barely a whisper. I arranged for it to show a negative result, yes. I knew from our surveillance that Olivia was seeing multiple men. The possibility that Daniel wasn't the father was real. I just made it a certainty. I sat in stunned silence, absorbing this revelation. The cornerstone of my revenge, the moment that had triggered Olivia and Daniel's public humiliation and downfall, had been based on a lie. Why? I finally managed. Why would you do that? Because you deserve to win, James said simply. After everything they put you through, you deserve to see them suffer. Was I wrong? I didn't have an answer for that. The moral implications were too complex to unravel in the moment. What about the letter? Why send it now? That wasn't me, James insisted. The lab must have genuinely discovered the error during a quality control review, They're legally obligated to report it. After we hung up, I sat for a long time, staring at the letter. Daniel was the father of Olivia's baby, a child who would be born while its mother was in prison, whose father had rejected it based on a falsified test. An innocent caught in the crossfire of adult deceptions. I should tell Daniel, I thought. He has a right to know. But would that change anything? Olivia had still been seeing Ethan and possibly Thomas Blackwell. She had still been embezzling from the company. She was still a con artist who had targeted Daniel for his money and position, and Daniel had still betrayed me, still lied about wanting children, still thrown away our marriage for a fantasy that had exploded in his face. The baby, though, the baby deserved better than to be a casualty of our war. I folded the letter and slipped it into my desk drawer. I would decide what to do about it tomorrow, or the next day, or perhaps never. For now, I had a life to rebuild, a future to plan that didn't revolve around Daniel or Olivia or revenge. As I climbed into bed that night, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me. For months, I had been consumed by anger, by the need to make Daniel and Olivia pay for what they'd done to me. That fire had driven me, sustained me, given me purpose when everything else had been stripped away. Now, with the flames finally dying down, I could see beyond the smoke and ash to the landscape of possibilities that stretched before me, a life that was mine alone, to shape however I chose. The revelation about the paternity test should have disturbed that peace, should have triggered a new moral crisis. But instead, it felt like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. A reminder that in the quest for justice, sometimes we become what we despise. Sometimes the line between victim and villain blurs until it disappears entirely. I had gotten everything I wanted. Daniel was destroyed. Olivia was facing years in prison. I had emerged from our marriage financially secure, and with my dignity intact. But at what cost to my soul? That was a question for another day. Tonight, I would sleep the deep, dreamless sleep of the victorious. Tomorrow, the rest of my life would begin. 6 months after the baby shower that changed everything, I was finally finding my rhythm in my new life. I had reopened my interior design business, reconnected with old friends, even gone on a few tentative dates, though none had progressed beyond dinner and polite conversation. The divorce had been finalized months ago. The scandal had faded from the local news, and I had carefully rebuilt my life into something that felt, if not completely whole, at least stable and mine. Daniel, from what I heard through Margaret during our monthly lunches, was struggling more. After being forced out of Walker Technologies, he had tried to start his own consulting firm, but his reputation had been too badly damaged. Clients were wary of associating with him. Former business partners kept their distance, and investors were skeptical. He had moved to a smaller apartment, sold his luxury car, and according to Margaret, was seeing a therapist twice a week to deal with his depression and anxiety. His fall from grace had been complete and devastating. As for Olivia, she had been sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud, with the possibility of parole after 4 years. The baby, a boy, had been born. In prison and immediately placed in foster care, as Olivia had no family willing to take him. Ethan had refused to be tested for paternity after Olivia's schemes were exposed, washing his hands of the entire situation. I still hadn't told Daniel about the letter from the laboratory. Each time I considered it, I found another reason to wait. He was too fragile. The information wouldn't change anything. It would only bring more pain. The baby was better off without him. But the truth nagged at me, a persistent itch I couldn't quite reach. An innocent child was growing up in the foster system while his biological father remained ignorant of his existence. Whatever Daniel had done to me, did that justify keeping this secret? I was pondering this question one rainy afternoon when my phone pinged with a news alert that made my blood run cold. Former Mistress of Tech CEO releases tell-all from prison. With shaking hands, I opened the article. Olivia had somehow managed to publish a memoir from behind bars, detailing her relationships with prominent businessmen in the city, including her affair with Daniel. The book, titled The Other Woman, My Life as a Mistress, was being marketed as an exposé of the corrupt business culture that enabled her activities. I scrolled through the article, my heart racing. According to early reviews, Olivia portrayed herself as a victim of circumstance, a beautiful young woman exploited by powerful men who promised her the world only to discard her when she became inconvenient. But the most shocking claim was that I had orchestrated her downfall out of jealousy, manipulating evidence and falsifying the paternity test to regain control over Daniel's fortune. Somehow, Olivia had discovered or guessed the truth about the test. My phone rang almost immediately. It was Margaret. "Have you seen it?" she asked, without preamble. "Just now," I replied, my voice tight. "How bad is it?" "Bad," she admitted. "Robert is already talking to our lawyers about a defamation suit, but you know how these things go. Once it's out there, it can't be called back." I finished her thought. "How's Daniel taking it?" Margaret sighed heavily. "Not well. He's been calling nonstop, but I can't quite make sense of what he's saying. He's distraught." I closed my eyes, a wave of weariness washing over me. Just when I thought it was over, when I'd finally begun to put the pieces of my life back. Together, Olivia had found a way to drag us all back into the darkness. "Sophia," Margaret said hesitantly, "some of what she's claiming, about you manipulating evidence, about the paternity test, Robert and I don't believe it for a second." "Of course, but you're wondering if there's any truth to it," I finished for her. "Only because it would affect our legal strategy," she clarified quickly. "We need to know what we're dealing with." I considered my options carefully. I could continue the lie, deny everything, let Margaret and Robert pursue their defamation suit against Olivia's claims. Or I could finally admit the truth, at least part of it. "The paternity test results were compromised," I said slowly. "I received a letter from the laboratory months ago confirming that Daniel is actually the father of Olivia's baby." Margaret gasped. "What? And you didn't tell us? Didn't tell Daniel?" "I was going to," I lied. "But then I thought, what good would it do? The baby was better off in foster care than with Olivia, and Daniel was in no state to be a father." "Sophia, that wasn't your decision to make," Margaret said, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. "That child is our grandchild, Daniel's son. The full weight of what I'd done, or rather what I'd failed to do, hit me then. In my focus on revenge, on making Daniel and Olivia pay for their betrayal, I had allowed an innocent child to become collateral damage. "You're right," I admitted quietly. "I should have told you as soon as I knew." "Where is the letter now?" Margaret demanded. "At my house, in my desk drawer." "Robert and I will be there in 20 minutes, she said firmly. "This changes everything. Sophia." After we hung up, I sat in stunned silence, watching rain streak down my windows. The carefully constructed narrative I'd built, of myself as the wronged wife seeking justice, of Daniel and Olivia as the villains who deserved everything that happened to them, was crumbling around me. Had I truly been seeking justice? Or had I simply wanted revenge, regardless of the cost? And what about the other claims in Olivia's book? She couldn't possibly know about James's manipulation of the paternity test, could she? That had been between James and me. Unless... I reached for my phone again, dialing James Fisher's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. A quick search online revealed why. James Fisher Investigations had closed abruptly 3 weeks ago. The website was down, the office phone disconnected. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. Had James sold our story to Olivia? It seemed unlikely. He had always been the consummate professional, discreet and ethical in his own way, despite what he'd done with the paternity test. But if not James, then who had told Olivia about the falsified test? The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. Margaret and Robert stood on my porch, their expressions grim. I ushered them inside, leading them to my home office, where I retrieved the laboratory letter from my desk drawer. Robert read it first, his face growing increasingly pale. He handed it to Margaret without a word, then turned to me. "Did you know about this falsification before it happened? Were you involved in arranging it?" I met his gaze steadily. "No. My investigator acted on his own initiative. I only found out about it when I received that letter." It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. James had never explicitly told me he was going to tamper with the test. I had simply not questioned the too-perfect outcome. Margaret finished reading the letter, her hands shaking slightly. "We need to get this to our lawyer immediately, and Daniel needs to know." "I'll tell him," I offered, surprising myself. "I'm the one who kept this from him. It should come from me." Robert nodded curtly. "Do it soon. Once Olivia's book hits the shelves, this whole mess will explode all over again." After they left with a copy of the letter, I sat at my desk for a long while, contemplating what to do next. Telling Daniel about his son would reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. It would force him to confront Olivia again, to engage with the legal system to establish paternity and seek custody. It would also mean admitting my role in keeping the truth from him all these months. But it was the right thing to do. The only thing to do, if I wanted to look at myself in the mirror without flinching. I picked up my phone and called Daniel's number. It rang several times before going to voicemail. I tried again with the same result. Concerned, I grabbed my keys and headed to his apartment. The doorman recognized me from my previous visit and let me up without announcement. I knocked on Daniel's door, hearing only silence from within. "Daniel?" I called. "It's Sophia. We need to talk. It's important." More silence. I was about to turn away when I heard a faint sound from inside, glass breaking perhaps, or something being knocked over. Alarmed, I tried the door handle. To my surprise, it was unlocked. I pushed the door open cautiously, calling Daniel's name again. The apartment was in disarray. Empty bottles littered the coffee table, takeout containers overflowed from the trash can, and clothes were strewn across furniture. But it was the living room wall that caught my attention. Daniel had created what could only be described as an investigation board. Printouts of articles about Olivia, photographs, financial documents, all connected with red string and annotated with his increasingly erratic handwriting. In the center was a printout of Olivia's book cover, with the words "Who helped her" scrawled across it in thick black marker. "Daniel?" I called again, moving deeper into the apartment. I found him in the bedroom, lying motionless on the bed, an empty pill bottle on the nightstand beside him. "Daniel!" I rushed to his side, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. He was unconscious but breathing. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, reporting a possible overdose. As I waited for the ambulance, I checked the pill bottle. Sleeping. Pills prescribed by his therapist. Empty when it should have contained at least 20 tablets according to the label. "Come on, Daniel," I murmured, rolling him onto his side in the recovery position. "Don't do this, not now." His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. I spotted his phone on the floor beside the bed, its screen cracked but still showing a series of unanswered calls from Margaret and Robert. He must have seen the news about Olivia's book and spiraled. The paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing Daniel's condition and loading him onto a stretcher. I followed the ambulance to the hospital, calling Margaret on the way to update her. Hours later, I sat beside Daniel's hospital bed, watching his chest rise and fall with each breath. The doctors had pumped his stomach and said he would recover. physically, but they were concerned about his mental state. Once he was stable, they planned to transfer him to the psychiatric unit for observation and treatment. Margaret and Robert had come and gone, stepping out to speak with the doctors and make arrangements. I had offered to leave, to give them privacy, with their son, but Margaret had insisted I stay. "You're here for a reason," she'd said. "He needs to hear what you came to tell him when he wakes up." So I waited, rehearsing what I would say, how I would explain everything. The truth about the paternity test, the existence of his son, my reasons for keeping it from him. Eventually, Daniel began to stir, his eyelids fluttering open. He looked disoriented, confused by the hospital room and my presence at his bedside. "Sophia?" he croaked, his voice raw. "What are you doing here?" "I came to your apartment to talk to you," I explained gently. "I found you unconscious." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by shame. "The book," he whispered. "Olivia's book. Did you see it?" I nodded. "I saw the article about it." "She's destroying me all over again," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "Just when I thought I'd hit rock bottom, she finds a way to dig deeper." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. "Daniel, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago." He looked at me warily, as if bracing for another blow. The paternity test results at the baby shower. They were wrong, contaminated. I reached into my purse and pulled out the letter, placing it on the bed beside him. "You are the father of Olivia's baby, your son." Daniel stared at me, uncomprehending. "What? But how?" "The laboratory sent me this letter months ago, explaining that they'd discovered the error during a routine quality control check. When they retested the samples properly, they confirmed you're the father." He struggled to sit up, wincing at the movement. "Why didn't you tell me? Why keep this from me?" I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his gaze. At first, I told myself it wouldn't change anything. Olivia was still a con artist, still going to prison. You were in no state to be a father. The baby was better off in foster care. "Those weren't your decisions to make," he said, echoing his mother's words. "I know that now," I admitted. "But the truth is, part of me still wanted you to suffer, to lose everything, the way I had, even if that meant an innocent child growing up without his father." Daniel was silent for a long moment, absorbing this revelation. "Where is he now?" "He," finally asked, his voice barely audible, "in foster care. He was born about 2 months ago, while Olivia was in custody." "A boy," Daniel whispered, a tear sliding down his cheek. "I have a son." The raw emotion in his voice cut through my defenses, reminding me that beneath all the anger and betrayal, beneath the strategic games Olivia and I had played with his life, Daniel was still human, still capable of love, still vulnerable to loss. "I'm sorry, Daniel," I said, meaning it for perhaps the first time since discovering his affair. "I should have told you as soon as I knew." He nodded, wiping away the tear. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," I replied honestly. "You can establish paternity officially, petition for custody. Given Olivia's situation, the courts would likely grant it." "I don't know the first thing about being a father," he said, fear creeping into his voice. "No one does, at first." I reached out, hesitantly touching his hand. "But you have your parents. They'll help you." Daniel looked at me, his eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions: gratitude, resentment, confusion, hope. "Thank you," he said finally, "for saving my life and for telling me the truth, even if it came too late." I nodded, standing to leave. "I'll let your parents know you're awake." As I turned to go, Daniel called after me. "Sophia?" I paused, looking back at him. Does this change anything? Between us, I mean. I considered the question carefully. Did knowing about his son, about my role in keeping them apart, change how I felt about Daniel? About our divorce? About the future? No, I said gently. Some things can't be undone, Daniel. Some betrayals can't be forgiven. But I hope you find happiness with your son. I hope you become the father he deserves. As I walked out of the hospital, into the cool evening air, I felt lighter somehow, as if a burden I hadn't realized I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. The truth was finally out. All of it. The web of lies and manipulations that had entangled us all was unraveling, leaving us to face the consequences of our actions with clear eyes. Olivia's book would hit the shelves soon, reopening old wounds and creating new ones, but it couldn't hurt me anymore. I had already confronted the worst parts of myself. The capacity for vengeance that had allowed me to keep a father from his son, to find satisfaction in another's suffering. I had won the battle with Daniel and Olivia, but at a cost I was only now beginning to understand. The price of revenge is paid not just by its targets, but by the one who seeks it. It changes you, hardens you, makes you capable of cruelties you never imagined. As I drove home through the darkening streets, I made a silent promise to myself. This chapter of my life was ending, finally and completely. Whatever came next. Whatever. Challenges Olivia's book brought, whatever complications arose from Daniel knowing about his son, I would face them with honesty and integrity. The game was truly over now. There were no winners, only survivors trying to rebuild from the ashes of what we had all destroyed together. And perhaps, in time, there would be healing. For Daniel and his son, for the Walkers, as they embraced their unexpected grandchild. Even, for me, as I learned to define myself, not by what had been done to me, or what I had done in response, but by who I chose to become now, in this new beginning. The final page had been turned. The story of Daniel, Olivia, and Sophia, the husband, the mistress, and the wife, was complete. It was time for a new story to begin. Was revenge worth the cost? As Sophia closed this chapter of her life, she understood that justice and vengeance have different prices and different rewards. If this tangled web of betrayal, deception, and ultimate truth kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button now. Subscribe for more gripping stories of relationships pushed to their breaking points, and leave a comment sharing what you'd have done in Sophia's shoes.